Can you talk about the example that you gave? It was a bizarre story in Chicago in 2009, which where there was a parking meter initiative and Morgan Stanley took it over. This is, I think, feeds really nicely into just the whole issue and discussion around privatization. But this seems this seemed pretty obviously like it would be a disaster from the get-go.
Yeah. So in Chicago in 2000 starting in 2008, Chicago decided they were going to sell or lease off all their parking meters, 36,000 parking meters for the next 75 years to a group of Wall Street investors led by the bank Morgan Stanley. And Chicago got $1.15 billion for a 75-year lease on the parking meters, which seemed like a lot of money at the time and perhaps seems like a lot of money to you when you think about putting quarters in a parking meter. But later studies showed that the city had actually been shorted by as much as $1 billion and perhaps several more. And not only that, not only had they gotten ripped off when they leased off their parking meters, but because they gave away their parking meters, they lost control of their streets. And so every time Chicago wants to build a bike lane or hold a ticker tape parade or close a street for a farmer's market, they have to negotiate with the company that runs the parking meters because they're taking meters out of revenue service and they need to make up for that elsewhere. So it's become a huge problem for Chicago. And I think that what that shows is what this deal shows to me is how little anyone really thinks about parking as a systemic issue in the urban landscape. And that is true also of its effect on housing prices. It's true of its effect on architecture, and it's true of its effect on our transportation choices. And all of these issues, to me, are knit together by this concept that parking is ignored and mismanaged at our peril.
What was the motivation behind the city making that deal? Was it quick cash from Morgan Stanley? I mean, I guess we're in the midst of the financial collapse at this point.
Right. Yeah. They're staring down the recession and thinking we can get $1 billion now,
Right.
and that sounds really great. And whatever the future brings, we'll deal with that when it comes. I think they made two arguments in favor, and one of them, which are common to privatization discussion, one of them was the technical expertise argument, which in this case I find particularly absurd. But it's that you need to let a private company do this because this public sector doesn't have the wherewithal, and
It's too
that may
complicated to understand the whole parking meter system. You could let the
exactly.
experts weigh in
No,
here.
you're joking, but yes, that's what they said, and that might be true if you're building a nuclear power plant or something like that, but not for parking meters. And then the second one, which is even funnier, is that they said they knew how Morgan Stanley was going to make this money. They knew why the bank thought that the parking meters were worth more than $1 billion, and it's because the bank was planning to immediately triple, and in some cases even more than that, raise the parking meter rates. But they said we would never be able to do that because politically it would be too challenging for us. So we'll have to sell them off to Morgan Stanley. They can raise the rates and make money from it, but we as a city council would never be able to achieve that objective.
That is dark. I wanted to ask you about parking and how it interacts with our environment and the environmental crisis. What are some of the effects that these like massive lots and parking allocation, what does that do to our environment?
Yeah, well, I think the most fundamental thing is that parking encourages driving. It is both a subsidy for car ownership and car use, and it creates a ruined urban environment that is low density, dangerous for pedestrians, and poorly served by transit. And so all of those things combine to create huge incentives to drive. Transportation is the country's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as producing a number of other externalities, such as car crashes, local particulate pollution, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need to go into all that. But parking is the lever to control people's transportation choices. And free parking encourages lots of driving. So that's the first environmental consequence. And then the second one is all of the material that goes into building all this parking. I mean, I talked to a developer in Dallas in the book who's a commercial real estate developer who owns office space. And he was getting fed up with building all these parking garages that were half unused for all his structures, which were required both by local laws and also required by lenders. And he would build all this parking and he would say, like, just think about all the concrete and asphalt and energy that is getting wasted in producing all this parking that is going to sit mostly empty most of the time. And that is the case for parking in this country. I mean, we have 1 to 2 billion parking spaces, and that means we have at least 3 and potentially 6 or 7 for every car. And some of those cars are in motion. So the parking stock is mostly unused, and that's an enormous amount of waste just to have built all that. And then obviously it has a more direct effect on the environment as well, because you are paving over natural land, you are creating impervious surface that floods, sends rainwater and stormwater into the sewers during big rainfall events, and also contributes to the urban heat island. It's just, a parking lot is not obviously a very friendly place for natural life.
Certainly not. I mean, do you see positive developments on this front in terms of new housing maybe being built in cities and them saying these parking requirements that are assigned to suburban standards that we have to stick with? This is not realistic in this day and age. Are we seeing any progress on that front?
Yeah, I think it has pretty broad cross-political appeal because liberals rightly see these requirements as a subsidy for fossil fuels, a contributor to lots and lots of driving, which has lots of externalities, and also an impediment to building affordable housing. Whereas conservatives, I think, would rightly see them as a kind of needless imposition on what you are free to do with your property. And so these reforms have found a pretty broad success in the last 5 years. There's a group called the Parking Reform Network that is actually made up of people who are obsessed with parking, and they're all over the country, and they go to city council meetings and they make these arguments about why we should change the laws in the hopes of, allowing ourselves to provide affordable housing, walkable urbanism, attractive architecture, all these things that have been basically impossible to achieve because of all this parking. And since I started writing this book in 2017, dozens of cities and even a couple states have changed their policy on this issue. So it is happening right now. And I think there's a greater and greater awareness that if your number one concern is traffic, if it's affordable housing, if it's the environment, if it's the architectural quality of your neighborhood, and your number one request is parking, that you have to understand that those things are at cross purposes.
Do you think that the pandemic changed certain attitudes towards this, when now we're having a bit of like a realization that the commuting obsession is maybe not as necessary for certain sectors?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things going on. I mean, number one, you're going to have a lot of overbuilt downtown parking and also overbuilt retail parking as e-commerce takes off and begins to replace people driving to the store and leaving their car there. So one more reason to think more flexibly about sharing parking, about building new structures that don't require parking, that can make use of that existing overbuilt stock. The other factor, of course, is the potential problems associated with mass transit losing its downtown office space, right? Like a lot of transit use was subsidized by people going downtown every day. And if we lose that feature and transit systems lose all those ticket buyers, does that have consequences for people's ability to live a car-free life in and around their neighborhood? So I think we're going to see how that plays out. I mean, for now, I would say in the neighborhoods, I think the development since 2020 has been very positive. There were, you may remember in 2020, there were all these restaurants that decided overnight that this parking that had hitherto been considered an absolutely essential feature of the urban environment and of doing business, don't touch it. We'll go out of business if you take away our parking. All of a sudden they were like, actually, we don't need the parking for this. We can just turn it into restaurant seating. And I think that was a phenomenal success and showed people like it moved the Overton window a little bit in
Mm.
terms of thinking, why have we consigned all this public space just for the storage of automobiles? What if we were to do something else with it? And and that doesn't need to be just restaurant seating, of course. I mean, that's only the tip of the iceberg. And I think this is catching on even in places like, again, I was just in Cincinnati, and in the Over the Rhine neighborhood in Cincinnati, there are beautiful parklets that have been formerly parking spaces that have now been converted into public space. Um, and here we are 3 years after. So I know there's a sense of retrenchment, and that some of the car-free streets during the pandemic have been rolled back. But I think people's perspective has permanently shifted.
Well, that's a good thing. Henry Grabar, staff writer at Slate, author of Paved Paradise: How Parking Explains the World. We'll put a link to your book everywhere you're listening to this or watching this, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today, Henry. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.